land of Mordor, in the fires of Mount Doom, the Dark Lord Sauron.
The Lord of the Rings. The Fellowship of the Ring changed what people expected from fantasy films. It wasn't just elves, swords, and epic battles. It was a living, breathing world. Peter Jackson's first installment in the trilogy became a landmark in cinematic history, with practical effects, painstakingly detailed world-building, and actors who often put their bodies on the line for the story. Fellowship brought Middle-earth to life like nothing before it. But even if you've watched the movie dozens of times, there are still some details you probably missed, some so strange they feel like they belong in Tolkien's appendices. Here are 20 weird facts you didn't know about the Fellowship of the Ring. Number 20. Aragorn broke his toe in a different movie but still got injured here. You've probably heard the story about Viggo Mortensen breaking his toe during the Two Towers, but did you know Fellowship almost broke him too? Viggo wasn't the original actor cast as Aragorn. Stuart Townsend had trained for 2 months but was replaced at the last minute because Jackson decided he looked too young for the role. Viggo got the call and said yes only because his son was a Tolkien fan. With little prep time, Viggo threw himself into the role completely. He insisted on using a real sword instead of a prop one. That meant every swing, block, and parry had real weight and real danger. He chipped a tooth during a fight scene and asked for super glue to fix it so they could keep filming. Jackson insisted they pause and bring in a proper dentist. In one scene, when Aragorn deflects a knife thrown by an Uruk-hai, that wasn't CGI. The knife was real, and Viggo's parry with his sword actually saved him from getting hit. The crew froze. If his timing had been off by even a second, the story might have ended very differently. Viggo wasn't just playing a ranger. He was living like one. He slept in the woods, carried his sword off set, and stayed in costume whenever possible. Everyone said the same thing. It wasn't just method acting. It was something more profound, as if he had become Aragorn long before filming was over. Number 19. The iconic ring had to be resized a lot. You would think the One Ring, one of the most important properties in all 3 films, was a single, sacred item. But in truth, there were over 30 different versions of it, each crafted for a specific shot or scene. Some were heavy, made of solid gold or brass. Others were huge, built 5 times the standard size, just for close-up shots. When Frodo drops the ring onto the floor in Bag End, it hits the wood with a heavy thud. That was no ordinary ring. That sound was created using a large, weighted prop ring dropped onto a wooden plank from just the right height. The goal was to make it feel unnatural, like it had weight beyond what metal could explain. And the result was perfect. It wasn't just sound, it was menace. In addition to resizing, the crew had to account for all kinds of lighting conditions. In scenes where the ring had to shine or glow subtly, they used specially polished versions. In others, they used matte rings to reduce reflections. They even used magnets to make it stay in place on the actor's palm, without sliding during slow-motion scenes. So next time you see the ring glowing or hanging from a chain, know that you're likely looking at one of dozens of unique versions. In the end, the One Ring was many. Number 18. Gandalf hit his head for real, and they kept it. When Gandalf arrives at Bag End and bangs his head on the ceiling beam, it's one of those subtle, humanizing moments. But here's the weird part. It wasn't in the script. Ian McKellen actually hit his head by accident during the take. He was walking through the Hobbit hole set, which had been built to scale for the much smaller hobbits. McKellen, being over 6 feet tall, wasn't supposed to walk that deep into the corridor during rehearsal, but during the take, he misjudged the space. Instead of breaking character, he let out a grunt, stayed in the scene, and continued delivering his lines as if Gandalf had done it on purpose. Peter Jackson loved it. He didn't just keep the scene in the movie. He adjusted the tone of that sequence to emphasize the old wizard's discomfort in the Hobbit world. This moment became iconic, not because it was planned, but because it was real. It's a small example of how authenticity often wins out over precision. The mistake helped ground the fantasy in something human. Gandalf the Grey, wielder of great power, still had to duck under ceiling beams like everybody else. Number 17. Sean Bean refused the helicopter. The snowy mountains you see in the Fellowship of the Ring were as real as they look. When the Fellowship begins their icy climb across the pass of Caradhras, Peter Jackson wasn't interested in shooting on a fake indoor snow set. He wanted nature, real wind, real breath in the cold. So the cast and crew were flown each day by helicopter to shoot in the southern Alps of New Zealand. It wasn't easy terrain. The wind could change fast and landing zones were narrow and icy. The ride up wasn't exactly smooth either, but for Sean Bean, who played Boromir, it was terrifying. Sean Bean has a well-known fear of flying. The idea of getting into a small helicopter and flying into dangerous mountain territory didn't sit well with him. So instead of delaying the shoot or demanding accommodations, he made his own solution. Every day that the crew was shooting in the mountains, Bean would get into full Boromir costume, including heavy boots, fur-lined cloak, shield, sword, and armor, then hike to the shooting location. Alone, on foot. His castmates would watch from above as the red dot of his cloak moved slowly up the trail. It became a running joke. There goes Sean, hiking to work like Boromir himself, determined and proud. But it wasn't just for laughs. There was something about the way he quietly did it that stuck with people. It matched who Boromir was, a soldier of Gondor, a man of pride and duty. Sean Bean didn't just act the part, he lived it. The hike wasn't short either. In some cases, it took over 2 hours to reach the set, but Bean said he preferred that to the few minutes of fear he'd have to endure in the chopper. In hindsight, the story has become a fan favorite, and when you re-watch those snowy scenes, it's hard not to think of Boromir's stubborn march up the mountain, not just as a performance, but as a real physical journey that the actor himself made, day after day. Number 16. A real fire almost ruined the Council of Elrond. The Council of Elrond is one of the most memorable scenes in the Fellowship of the Ring. All the major characters come together in one place. There's tension, drama, and that iconic moment when Frodo steps forward to take the ring. But what audiences don't see is that behind the polished scene, chaos nearly derailed the entire shoot. The set for Rivendell was built outdoors with intricate detail, pillars carved with elven symbols, stone walkways, and golden lighting filtering through artificial trees. To achieve the soft, otherworldly glow that makes Rivendell feel timeless, the crew utilized powerful lights positioned just off camera. These lights weren't ordinary. They were massive industrial-grade film lights, and they generated severe heat. During one day of shooting the council scene, one of those lights overheated and caught fire. The set crew acted quickly. Within seconds, they began extinguishing the flames before they could spread. Smoke started filling the area, cables were being moved, and there was a moment where everything nearly had to stop. But here's the wild part. The actors kept going. Some of them didn't even realize what was happening at first. Others noticed and just stayed in character. Peter Jackson and the team made the call to keep rolling once things were back under control, and somehow, the energy of that disruption carried into the scene. When you watch the Council of Elrond now, you'd never guess that a fire had almost forced the team to halt production. Everything looks peaceful, but beneath that calm is the memory of an almost disaster. The crew later said that moment showed just how unpredictable filming in a fantasy world could be. Even in Rivendell, things can burn. It also speaks to how much pressure the team was under. They were shooting 3 massive films at once, often with little room for delays. Every minute mattered. So when that fire flared up, there was no time for panic, just fast thinking, steady hands, and a bit of movie magic to keep the day alive. Number 15. The orc scream was made by a sound designer's wife. In a movie filled with trolls, wargs, and orcs, you'd expect the screams and battle cries to be pulled from deep sound libraries or high-tech studios, but sometimes the best sound comes from the most unexpected places, like a parking lot outside a recording booth. During post-production on The Fellowship of the Ring, sound designer David Farmer needed a particular kind of scream, something primal, not just a loud noise, but a scream that felt like it came from the throat of a furious, dying creature. Nothing in the archive sounded right, so he turned to the person closest to him, his wife. He brought her outside into the studio parking lot and asked her to scream, just one full-throated yell. She gave it everything, the kind of scream you'd expect in a nightmare. Farmer recorded it on the spot and later processed the sound to blend it with other layers. That scream became one of the orc death cries you hear during the Mines of Moria sequence. It wasn't from a stuntman or an actor in prosthetics. It wasn't generated by software. It was just a woman helping her husband out on a late night. That scream made it into one of the most intense action scenes in the entire trilogy. And unless you know the story, you'd never think to question it. The truth is, The Lord of the Rings was full of those do-it-yourself moments. The crew used walnuts cracking to simulate bone, planks bending to mimic creaking towers, and, in this case, a parking lot scream to give life to an enemy's final moment. It's a reminder that sometimes the most significant moments in film aren't made with money or machines, they're made with creativity and a little help from home. Number 14. Frodo's eyes change color, and no one noticed for years. It's the kind of mistake you don't notice unless someone points it out, and even then you might need to rewind. In The Fellowship of the Ring, Elijah Wood plays Frodo with striking blue eyes. They stand out, especially in close-up shots. But not every shot of Frodo shows those same blue eyes. In some scenes, particularly the early ones in the Shire, Frodo's eyes appear brown. Why the inconsistency? Here's what happened. Elijah Wood wore blue contact lenses during parts of the film to better match the look Peter Jackson wanted for Frodo, bright, piercing eyes that stood out. But Wood found the lenses irritating and difficult to wear during long shoots, especially outdoors. In certain scenes, the crew decided to skip them altogether to keep Wood comfortable and focused. Because the lighting conditions changed, and because of how the camera was calibrated for skin tone and costume, Wood's real eye color sometimes looks distinctly brown on film. No one on the crew expected it to be noticeable, but fans with keen eyes caught on years later, and it became a small piece of movie trivia that still pops up in online forums. Some joked that the ring was messing with Frodo's appearance. Others chalked it up to continuity errors. What's interesting is that the filmmakers didn't try to fix it in later versions digitally. The difference remains not because they forgot, but because it was part of the lived experience of shooting this massive project. And for many fans, it's actually a comforting detail. It reminds us that this epic billion-dollar fantasy still had very human practical choices being made along the way. Sometimes you just need your actor to blink and breathe. Number 13. Liv Tyler had to learn to speak Elvish while running on wet rocks. The scene where Arwen rides with Frodo to outrun the Black Riders is one of the most thrilling in the film. Horses charging through the forest, the sound of hooves pounding the earth, the ringwraiths closing in. Then suddenly Arwen turns and speaks in Elvish, calling on the power of the river to rise and carry the enemy away. It's an unforgettable moment. But filming it was a nightmare. Liv Tyler, who played Arwen, had to perform much of that scene while galloping on horseback, soaked to the bone and shouting lines in a language she didn't speak. The Elvish lines were not just made-up syllables. They were constructed from Tolkien's original languages, Sindarin and Quenya, and had grammar, pronunciation rules, and stress accents. Liv had to memorize the lines phonetically and deliver them with the right emotion while also acting, riding, and trying not to fall off a horse. And it didn't stop there. For the close-up shots, Tyler had to run barefoot over slippery rocks next to the riverbed. The original plan was to use a stunt double, but Peter Jackson wanted to capture the emotional intensity in her face up close. Tyler agreed, but it wasn't easy. The rocks were freezing, the water was moving fast, and she had to scream lines she had learned only a few days earlier. Years later, she said it was one of the hardest things she'd ever done on a film set, and it's no wonder. Learning an ancient language while soaked and running on wet stone isn't exactly standard practice for most actors. But that moment when Arwen calls the flood feels real and grounded because Tyler gave it everything. Not just the words, but the breath, the fear, the urgency. Most people remember the charging horses and the rising water, but behind that scene was a young actress standing barefoot in a river shouting ancient Elvish into the wind. Number 12. The hobbits wore real hair on their feet and it took hours. The hobbits' hairy feet are one of the most memorable visual traits in The Lord of the Rings. Fans of Tolkien's books expected it. Hobbits are supposed to be slight, earthy, and barefoot, with large, padded feet covered in thick, curly hair. The film nailed that detail, but it came at a price. Every morning, the four actors who played the central hobbits, Elijah Wood, Sean Astin, Dominic Monaghan, and Billy Boyd, had to report to makeup hours before anyone else, not because of elaborate prosthetics or armor, but because of their feet. The makeup team used latex foot slippers that slid over the actors' real feet. These were sculpted to look natural with individual toes and ridges. Then came the hair. Each foot was hand-laid with strands of real hair. which had to be glued on and styled to match Tolkien's description. On a good day, it took about 90 minutes to get each actor fully ready. On longer days, when multiple costume changes or action scenes were scheduled, the feet had to be reapplied, dried, touched up, or completely replaced mid-day. The actors couldn't just kick them off either. Once they were on, they stayed on, and they weren't comfortable. The foot prosthetics were hot and tight, and when shooting on rough terrain, they offered little protection. Sean Astin, who played Samwise, once stepped on a piece of glass while filming and had to get stitches. Blood poured through the fake foot, ruining the scene. In the behind-the-scenes footage, you can hear Jackson shout, "Cut!" not for a flubbed line, but because of Sam's real-life injury. Despite the discomfort, the hairy feet became part of the actors' rhythm. It reminded them they weren't themselves anymore. They were hobbits, earthbound, barefoot, and walking toward something much bigger than themselves. Number 11. Christopher Lee was the only cast member who actually met Tolkien. When Christopher Lee was cast as Saruman, some fans already knew he had a legendary career in cinema. He played Dracula, Count Dooku, and countless other dark or mysterious figures. But what most people didn't know is that Lee was the only person in the entire Lord of the Rings cast who had ever met J.R.R. Tolkien. Lee was a lifelong fan of Tolkien's work. He read The Lord of the Rings every year, a tradition he had kept up for years. One evening in the early 1950s, he was invited to a pub in Oxford, where Tolkien himself was present. Lee said he was too shy to speak more than a polite greeting, but just the moment of shaking the author's hand stayed with him for decades. When Peter Jackson was casting the films, Lee didn't need convincing. He volunteered. At first, he wanted to play Gandalf, but the role ultimately went to Ian McKellen, and Jackson asked Lee to take on Saruman instead. Lee didn't mind. He knew the character inside and out. He knew every line. On set, he would occasionally correct people's pronunciation of Elvish words or Tolkien names, not because he was arrogant, but because he genuinely wanted it to be right. He once told Peter Jackson during a death scene, "That's not what it sounds like when a man is stabbed in the back." Jackson asked him how he could possibly know. Lee just gave him a look and said nothing. It's the kind of quiet intensity that Lee brought to every performance, but in Fellowship, it carried a special weight because it wasn't just acting. He was part of the only generation that could say they shook Tolkien's hand. And now, here he was, bringing his story to life. Number 10. The Nazgul screeches were made from a donkey. You remember the sound. That eerie, bone-crawling shriek that echoes whenever the Nazgul are near. It's not just scary, it's wrong, like it's scraping something inside your head. But what might surprise you is how that sound was made. Most fans assume it's a blend of metal and screaming, something digital, something tortured. In reality, the base layer for the Nazgul screech was made from the bray of a donkey. That's right, one of the scariest sounds in the Fellowship of the Ring started with a farm animal. The sound team at Weta Digital was experimenting with different vocalizations and distorted animal sounds. They tried bats, cats, and distorted human voices. Nothing worked. Then one day, a sound technician brought in a sample of a donkey screech, oud, echoing and guttural. They slowed it down, pitched it higher, layered it with effects, and suddenly it clicked. That was the scream. Of course, it wasn't just one sound. The final Nazgul shriek is made of several layers, including metal friction, wind, and whispers. But that first building block, the thing that made everyone stop and say, "That's it," was a donkey, and it's one of those weird, behind-the-scenes facts that feels almost too strange to believe, but it also speaks to the creativity behind the films. These weren't just fantasy creatures. Every sound, every footstep, every scream came from something real, just altered until it felt like something from another world. So the next time you feel a shiver when the ring wraiths appear, remember, somewhere deep in that scream is a very confused donkey. Number 9. Orlando Bloom was cast just days before filming began. When you watch Fellowship, it's hard to imagine anyone else playing Legolas. The calm eyes, the fluid movements, the bow drawn in perfect silence. Orlando Bloom made the elven warrior feel both elegant and dangerous. But here's what most people don't know. He was cast just 2 days before shooting began. At the time, Bloom was a complete unknown. He had recently graduated from drama school and had no major film credits. He auditioned for the role while still recovering from a serious back injury. A few years earlier, he had fallen from a rooftop and was told he might never walk again. That experience left him with a quiet determination that came through even in early screen tests. Peter Jackson liked what he saw. Bloom had a way of holding still and listening that made Legolas feel ancient. Not just another fighter, but someone who had lived long enough to choose silence over noise. Even though Bloom was new, he jumped into the role without hesitation. He trained in archery, horseback riding, and swordplay, often alongside more experienced actors. His physical grace made him a standout, and by the time the first movie came out, he was one of the breakout stars. There's something poetic about that. A fresh-faced actor with no big roles behind him, stepping into one of the oldest and wisest characters in Middle-earth and pulling it off just in time. Number 8, Viggo Mortensen sharpened his sword at home and carried it everywhere. If there's one actor who thoroughly blended into his character during filming, it was Viggo Mortensen. Once he stepped into Aragorn's boots, he didn't really step out. Off-camera, on breaks, even between takes, he carried his sword. Not a plastic replica, a real sharpened steel sword that could slice straight through a branch if needed. Viggo didn't just carry the sword as a prop. He treated it like a part of himself. He practiced with it in his trailer. He slept with it nearby. He even took it back to his hotel room after shooting each day, where he would sometimes sharpen it by hand. This wasn't some actor's ego trip. Viggo believed that if he didn't respect the weapon, he couldn't expect the audience to think Aragorn did either. In one interview, he explained that the sword represented legacy, danger, and discipline. To pretend it was just a costume piece would miss the point of the character. His dedication paid off in the fight scenes. Most of the time, he performed his stunts. During the battle at Amon Hen, when Aragorn faces the Uruk-hai, you can see the weight of his movements. That's not a choreographed Hollywood fight. It feels heavy because it is. The sword isn't rubber. The blood is fake, but the exhaustion is real. Some actors would show up, say their lines, and go home. Viggo Mortensen became a ranger. And once you know that, every scene he's in feels just a little more grounded, a little more dangerous, because that sword isn't just for show. It's real. Number 7. The Shire was built a full year before filming started. One of the most charming parts of the Fellowship of the Ring is the Shire. The rolling green hills, the round doors, the laundry drying in the sun, it feels lived in, it feels real. And that's because it was. Unlike most movie sets that are built weeks or even days before filming, the Shire set was constructed an entire year in advance. Peter Jackson made the unusual decision to let the location age naturally. He wanted grass to grow around the fences. He wanted moss to climb the stone walls. He wanted the place to feel like it had existed for generations. The set was built in Matamata, New Zealand on private farmland. The crew carved roads, dug gardens, planted real vegetables, and installed working chimneys. The goal was to make Hobbiton feel like an actual village. And over time, it did. By the time Elijah Wood, Sean Astin, and the rest of the cast arrived to film their first scenes, Hobbiton looked and smelled like a real place. Flowers were blooming, paths were worn, even the mailboxes had weathering from rain. It didn't feel like a set, it felt like home. Number 6. Peter Jackson had a secret cameo as a carrot-munching villager. If you blink during the early scenes in Bree, you might miss one of the most unexpected cameos in the Fellowship of the Ring. Right as the hobbits enter town, a grumpy-looking man is chewing on a carrot and watching them from the shadows. That man is none other than Peter Jackson himself. It wasn't his only cameo in the trilogy, but it was his first. Jackson liked to sneak himself into the films whenever he could, not because he wanted the spotlight, but because he thought it was fun, and because Alfred Hitchcock did it too. In this particular scene, Jackson wanted to appear as an unwelcoming Bree local. The weather was terrible that day, cold, rainy, and muddy. Instead of dressing up in some fancy cloak or wielding a cool weapon, he chose something simple: a hood, a coat, and a big orange carrot. He later joked that it was the coldest carrot he had ever eaten. Every time they yelled "cut," he had to take another bite. By the end of the day, he was sick of carrots for life, but the moment stuck. Fans have since gone back and paused the film, trying to catch every frame of his quiet little walk-on. And it became a kind of tradition. Jackson made cameos in all 3 films, each time in a different role. But the carrot-munching villager? That was the one that started it all. Number 5. The elven cloaks were made by a real monastic community. When the Fellowship receives their elven cloaks in Lothlorien, Galadriel says they will help them hide from enemies. They don't look flashy, just simple gray cloaks with a leaf-shaped brooch, but they carry weight. These cloaks represent a gift from an ancient people, a quiet shield for a dangerous journey ahead. What most viewers don't know is that the cloaks themselves weren't created in a standard costume department. Instead, they were woven by members of a traditional weaving guild in New Zealand, some of whom had been trained by monastic communities. These were people who practiced hand weaving as a discipline, not just a skill. No machines, no shortcuts. The fabric was created using natural dyes and traditional looms, then weathered by hand, so it looked like something the elves might make, timeless, practical, and slightly otherworldly. Each cloak had its tiny imperfections, which made it feel lived in. The leaf-shaped brooches, too, were not mass-produced. They were crafted in small batches, molded and hand-painted by artisans working in the Weta workshop. This level of detail is easy to miss on first watch. The cloaks drape silently over shoulders, flap in the wind, and disappear into shadows. But that's the point. They're not designed to impress. They're designed to blend. There's something quietly poetic about that. The most magical item in the film isn't a glowing sword or a ring. It's a plain gray cloak made by real hands with no two exactly alike. The elves didn't just give protection. They gave a piece of their world, made with care, to the people who would carry the burden forward. Number 4. Ian McKellen and Elijah Wood shot entire scenes without each other. One of the things that makes the Fellowship of the Ring feel so grounded is the relationships. Gandalf and Frodo especially have a bond that feels old and deep. Their scenes in Bag End are warm, gentle, and often quietly emotional. You'd think they were sitting together in the same cozy hobbit hole, but here's the thing, they weren't. In many of those scenes, Ian McKellen and Elijah Wood were acting alone. Because of the size difference between hobbits and men, Peter Jackson used a trick called forced perspective to make characters appear different heights. It's not CGI, it's old-school camera magic. McKellen might be sitting at one end of an elongated table while Wood sat several feet behind him. From the camera's angle, they looked side by side. In other setups, a double would sit in for one of the actors while the other delivered their lines alone. McKellen later said it was one of the most challenging parts of the job. In some scenes, he wasn't acting with Elijah at all. He was speaking to a green dot on a stick. There's a famous moment in the behind-the-scenes footage where McKellen, exhausted, breaks down crying on set. "I didn't become an actor," he says, to stare at a green screen. But the results speak for themselves. You never notice. The performances still connect, the camera tricks work, and the magic holds. It's one of those hidden sacrifices actors make that no one sees. We watch and feel moved, believing in this mentor-student relationship, never realizing that the actors sometimes never even made eye contact. Number 3. The horse that played Asphalloth chose Frodo on its own. You remember the chase scene. Frodo is wounded, the Nazgul are closing in, and Arwen lifts him onto a white horse named Asphalloth. She shouts to the steed in Elvish, and the horse takes off, racing toward the river with death right behind them. What you may not know is that during one take, the horse wasn't supposed to run without guidance. But it did, and it chose the right actor all on its own. Here's what happened. In one version of the scene, Elijah Wood was lying on the ground, waiting to be helped onto the horse by Liv Tyler. The horse had been trained to wait for cues, but before the cue came, it moved. It walked directly over to Wood, stood in front of him, and gently lowered its head as if to say, "I'm ready." The trainers were shocked. The horse hadn't been cued. It just moved. Jackson decided to roll with it. Tyler helped Wood up, and the horse took off right on time. That was the take they ended up using. What made the moment special wasn't just the timing, it was the connection. Liv Tyler later said it felt like the horse had become part of the story, sensing what was needed and stepping into the scene like an actor hitting their mark. Number 2, Gollum appeared long before he was cast. In the Fellowship of the Ring, Gollum is mostly hidden, seen only in glimpses, eyes glowing in the darkness of Moria or a silhouette darting through the mines. The whole performance by Andy Serkis, complete with motion capture, wouldn't come until The Two Towers. But what most people don't realize is that Gollum was already in the film long before Serkis had even been cast. Early in production, Peter Jackson knew that the audience needed to feel Gollum's presence, even if they didn't see him clearly. But without a final actor or voice, the team had to improvise. During some of the early shots, members of the crew stood in for Gollum, crawling through tunnels or whispering the now famous word, precious. In a few scenes, sound effects team members did the voice. In others, storyboard artists or assistant editors crouched in the shadows just to give the actors a point of reference. Gollum wasn't yet a character, he was a placeholder, a shadow, a whisper on the edge of the story. Eventually, Andy Serkis was brought on board for the second film, but when he saw what had already been done, he knew he had a challenge. He had to match the tension already built in Fellowship, those tiny hints, those eerie sounds, and bring the character to whole life. He didn't just voice Gollum, he became him, giving the creature a history, a rhythm, and a heart-wrenching sadness. Number 1. The film almost had a completely different ending. You'd think that a movie based on a beloved book would end exactly the way the book does. But that wasn't always the plan for the Fellowship of the Ring. In early drafts of the script, Peter Jackson considered pushing the timeline further, possibly ending the film after Frodo and Sam reached the edge of Mordor in the Two Towers, rather than at the breaking of the Fellowship. There was even discussion of ending on a huge cliffhanger, Boromir's death, Frodo's escape, and the rest of the Fellowship scattered, but no resolution. The studio was nervous. They wanted a strong ending. Jackson, however, felt that the story should breathe. He wanted to honor the book's quiet parting, Frodo looking across the river, Sam vowing to follow him, and the simple idea that the journey was far from over. In the end, Jackson's instincts won. The final scene with Frodo and Sam alone in the distance gave the film a tender, emotional landing. It didn't rely on explosions or plot twists. Just two friends walking toward an uncertain future, with a promise between them. The Fellowship of the Ring isn't just a fantasy movie, it's a world people return to again and again, a place where the props were handmade, the actors walked through real mountains, and even the smallest scenes were filled with care. From a donkey scream turned Nazgul cry to a barefoot actress speaking ancient Elvish by a freezing river, these behind-the-scenes moments remind us that magic isn't only in the story, it's in how the story is told. Which of these facts surprised you the most? Or did we miss your favorite behind-the-scenes detail? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more deep dives into the greatest films ever made.